Greetings to all the fighters, commissars, and all the progressive forces in all parts of the world. Today's presentation is going to focus on the history of South Africa, the geopolitical territory. We call South Africa one of the very few countries in the world that has got a geographic name, South of Africa. So we're going to contextualize where we come from as this political territory called South Africa. And a lot of people are going to ask, why are we discussing South Africa? Why are we discussing the history of South Africa? It is important to do so because we are taking a serious and notable lesson from Marcus Garvey, who says that a people without a knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. But also are taking a lesson from Marcus Tullius Cicero, one of the greatest Roman Empire leaders, who said that to be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child, So we do not want to be children. We want to understand where we're going so that we can put in clearer context the politics that we are confronted with now. But also we're taking a lesson from Anton Muziwa Kelambede, the first president of the Congress Youth League, who said that one who wants to create the future must not forget the past. It is important that we understand where we come from so that we understand clearly the politics that we're engaged in now and where they come from. But also our ideological tools of analysis, our guide to action, Marxism, is founded on the philosophy of historical materialism, which basically says that we came from different stages of human development, and we must appreciate that the stage that we're in now, which is capitalism, is not the end phase of human societal development. So we're going to deal with history of South Africa and context so that we're able to do and understand clearly what defines our politics now. And the reason why we have to discuss the history of South Africa is because there are so many colonial and mostly white narratives that tend to define South Africa's history as the history of white people. So a lot of history books, even the history that is taught in schools in our curriculum, focuses on the history of white people. So if you check so many books and textbooks, there are so many which we are going to make reference to here. Some even go to the extent of saying that the history of South Africa started in Portugal, or started in Holland, or started in 1652, when the settler colonialists arrived in South Africa to begin a process of devastating and brutal colonization of a territory we call South Africa today. So we're going to give that context so that all of us understand properly where we come from. And that is the most important thing that we can do for ourselves. And this cannot be an exhaustive discussion because history is too much. There is too much information. There are so many books that have been written. There's so many archaeological books and discoveries that illustrate what was before we were. So we need to understand that in context so that we're able to give a proper context. In the readings that we have prescribed for this particular discussion, we said that we must look into a book by Leonard Thompson on the history of South Africa. It is one of the most important books because it acknowledges and gives a clearer context of the history of Africans in pre-colonial situations, in the pre-colonial context. A lot of history books, a lot of history narratives, a lot of chronologies of where South Africa comes from almost always starts from 1652, as if Africans never existed in this part we call South Africa today. And an interesting observation that is made in this particular book is that indigenous Southern Africans were not a tabula rasa of white invaders or capitalists to civilize or to victimize. Over many centuries, they had been developing social forms and cultural traditions that colonialism, capitalism, and apartheid have assaulted, abused, and modified, but never eradicated. And that speaks to the history of the entire African continent. What we have experienced as Africans, as people who come from the African continent, the indigenous Africans, was the destruction of our civilizations, of our systems of knowledge, of our understanding, of our trade systems. So if you check the entire history of the African continent, there are so many African empires that were destroyed by colonialism and that were undermined and integrated into the European and Eurocentric history, such that we do not know where we come from. They did that deliberately because they wanted to eradicate the black race. They wanted to integrate us only as slaves with no rights, as properties. Because what slavery meant was that black people were not recognized as human beings. They were just appendages of the white capitalist establishment. They were just appendages of the emerging capitalist system that said that these human beings, because they've got some degree of consciousness, let us use them as part of the machines. Let us treat them as property. That is why when slavery was abolished, those who owned slaves were paid money, they were compensated to say that we're now taking your property away from you. So in line with the laws of natural justice, of Eurocentric racist justice, they said, let us compensate the former owners of slaves. That is where we come from. That our history, our systems have been destroyed over time. And what is an interesting observation as well is that most historians tend to ignore the so many archaeological foundations and discoveries that have existed and have happened here in the African continent to illustrate that there were people here who have been here as indigenous people long before the arrival of the colonial settlers. And in many instances, we have been in developing our own systems of existence. We have been harvesting nature for our own survival, for our own subsistence. And we have been living a life that is worth celebrating in some instances, but with an appreciation that the primitive societal systems were not the end phase. We need to always develop as society. So the development of society must not be underrated in a manner that it took place. That is one of the issues that we must then deal with. And one of the things that is made in the book that we're making a reference to, which is our base document for this discussion. The interesting thing about this book is that we can always circulate it. All of you who need that copy, you must go to the EFF website, and then you'll be able to get the electronic version of this book that gives a clearer context of some of the issues. And of course, because it is written by the descendants of colonial settlers, it will always distort some of the issues. There are no history books that tell the correct story of Africans, but we must try to put what we have into clearer context. And this is one of the better contextualization of where we come from as a people. And we need to understand that in clarity. And one of the things that is said there is that most modern people assume that the hunter-gatherers in this part we call South Africa today were so incompetent and were undernourished, and that they had to work continuously to survive. That scholars have demonstrated that the assumption is false. That assumption that the hunter-gatherers, the primitive African society, was just an undernourished an incompetent group of people is a false basis to understand where we come from as a people. That scholars, the proper historians, and archaeology has demonstrated that such is not the case. So in one of the issues that must be understood is that one of the archaeologists says that the indigenous Africans lived in a kind of material plenty because they had adapted the tools of their living to the materials which lay in abundance around them and which were free for anyone to take. So there wasn't as the poverty, the directionless, the barbarism which is told in European history of Africa. So we never had a barbarian society. We had systems that were existing long before the arrival of colonial settlers. But also, the earliest evidence that we have of this transformation shows that the people were cultivating crops and using iron implements at several places in river valleys below the mountain. That is what used to happen long before the arrival of colonialists. The farming population gradually expanded across the escarpment and increased in numbers. That is basically what defined where we come from as a people. And it's one of the issues that we must always appreciate, that long before the arrival of colonialists, there were people here in a part we call South Africa today. And also we must take this opportunity to dismiss the neo-colonial, the actually colonial myth that Africans, indigenous Africans who are occupying this part called South Africa today, arrived here as a result of mass migration, that they came in huge numbers at once. And then when the colonialists were coming from the Cape this way, that there were Africans coming from what is Central and Western or Eastern Africa. And then they met here in a territory called South Africa. It is not the case. They found all of us here, the Khoi and the San, and the people whom they defined as Bantu people. All of us who speak African languages, we have always been resident of this particular territory. There is more than 100 years proof, 100,000 years proof of the existence of people, of Africans in the entire territory of Southern Africa, inclusive of Zimbabwe, Zambia, Namibia, Botswana, Swaziland, Lesotho, and all these areas. There is archaeological evidence that illustrates that there was always people who were engaged in their own activities and programs for survival. The history of Mapungubwe always illustrates that there was some degree of civilization that defined those people. And actually the proper rating of Mapungubwe is that the people that existed there, they used to trade in gold and iron ore with even countries such as India and China at that particular time. So to say that the colonialists are the ones that came with all these basic things that we need for survival is a distortion of history that has got racial, racist undertones and a class agenda. That is what we must always understand, that we must never ever believe the master colonial historical narratives of where we come from as a people who have always been here. And of course, we must give context of the state formation that defined colonialism in South Africa. So you know that we had said in the other presentation that the contact of Europeans with the part we call South Africa today did not begin in 1652 with the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck and the Dutch East Indian Company, VOC. It was not the first contact. Far much earlier, like the more recorded history is the one of Bartolomeo Dias, who used to use the Cape as a stop-by point in their trade voyages with India. And then later on, the voyages, the trade voyages, and the attempts of so-called discovery of Vasco da Gama. But also what we must highlight is that the entire Dutch East Indian Company, which was the dominant force that time, only arrived in 1652, more than 100 years since the Europeans had been in contact with a territory we call South Africa today. And one of the significant contacts which we must highlight, always highlight, is the contact of the Cape with Francisco de Almeida. Francisco de Almeida was a viceroy of India. He was a Portuguese general. So the Portuguese, before the rise of the Dutch as a dominant force in the world, Portugal was a dominant force in the world. It was a hegemon. So in a theory which we explained before of the line cycle theory, or the hegemonic stability theory, you always have a dominant nation in the world that tends to be the one that directs the pace, the form and content of global trade, either because they had superior technology, either because they had navigational systems that got to dominate how trade must be determined and conducted all over the world. So in 1510, Francisco de Almeida had contact with the Cape, and he made one of the first attempts to dispossess the Khoi people of their land, of their animals, wanted to abduct children because they wanted to make this part we call South Africa a Portuguese colony. So if they had succeeded in their first attempt, maybe South Africa could have been a Portuguese colony. But it did not happen because the Khoi people, the indigenous South Africans, fought back, and Francisco de Almeida was killed in the Cape because of the courageous and resistant spirit of the Khoi, who said that we have been in contact with Europeans for a very long time. We have been trading with them. We know them. They pass through here every time they go to whichever destination that they're going to. And they've never tried to take our land. You want to take our land, we're going to fight back with everything else that we have. And in that battle, the Battle of Salt River, the Khoi emerged victorious and defeated and killed, correctly so, Francisco de Almeida, a general who had terrorized many parts of the world, a general of the Portuguese criminal empire, were terrorized many parts of the world. So we were able to actually end the pain of so many nations in the world who were terrorized by Francisco de Almeida. We must claim that victory because it is one of the first significant resistance movements that got to define the people of South Africa. And of course, long before the Jan van Riebeeck detachment decided to settle in the Cape to establish a refreshment station, there were more than 2,000 ships that had passed via the Cape in their trade voyages with India. So the world map, before the creation of the Suez Canal, the Europeans had to pass through the Cape in order to go and trade with the east of the world, because to carry so many goods and products, you needed those ships that had been developed as a technological innovation of that particular period. So that is what used to happen, that their trade voyages had to take a longer route of between 3 to 6 months. So they had to stop at the Cape for refreshments. And then in 1652, Jan van Riebeeck established a refreshment station, which was then the beginning of the colonization of a territory we call South Africa today. That is where it all began, That is where they began to subjugate the indigenous people to colonial rule, to colonial systems. That is when they began to destroy our people, to fight with them physically, and killed a lot of them, subjected them to slave control. They turned the landowners into slaves in their own territory. That is what they did. Like, they arrived here and said that we know that you have been here for a very long time, but because we've got military superiority, we are now going to take over your land, we're going to take over your minerals, we're going to integrate you into our system. They even passed a Vagrancy Act, which said that any indigenous person who resides in this territory must necessarily work for a white person. If you do not work for a white person, you are a vagrant. You do not belong in this particular territory. That is where it all comes from. And then you will know that earlier in 1795, the British, in this line cycle theory, now were beginning to be the hegemon of the world, the dominant force in all over the world. And then they dispossessed the Dutch East Indian Company, which was attached to the Dutch Empire. They dispossessed them of the Cape Colony, and then took that as their colonial territory. But through their own negotiations later on, that colony was returned back to the Dutch, and then later on it was taken again. So in 1803, it was returned to the Dutch through a treaty which they signed amongst themselves as white colonial settlers. And then said that, no, you can take it now. But back in 1806, the British reconquered the Cape and took it now permanently as a British colony. So the Cape became a British colony in terms of what happened. And then amongst themselves, they started to have differences. The Dutch claiming that this is our land, we occupied it first. The British saying that this is our territory as well. And then began a process of importation of slaves into what we call South Africa today. Then slaves were then brought from all parts of the world, from France, from Mozambique, from many other parts of the world, in terms of what got to happen. And then of course, in that period, Africans were existing in almost all parts of what we call South Africa today. The formation of the Zulu kingdom happened from 1816 with the leadership of Shaka. And of course, it was trying to have an empire, a Zulu empire, which was conquering other African nations to establish a Zulu empire, so that you have got an empire that is dominated by the Zulu nation in that particular period. That is what got to happen. And then in 1834, the British colony, because of their own dynamics back home, they abolished slavery, because slavery was an accepted phenomenon. So slavery was legal, was legislated. So legislators, everyone else, when they list the property, they will say, I've got a house, I've got a car, and I've got slaves, I've got 3 slaves. So slaves were used to be counted as part of the properties of white people. So for a very long time, as black people, we were properties of white minorities, not only in South Africa, in all parts of the world. Now, this is what is very important to highlight, that when slavery was established, was abolished between 1834 and 1838, the slaves, the Khoi and San slaves, who were now dispossessed of their land were freed. But you free people who do not have land, who do not have any means of survival, who are not allowed to own land. So although they were freed, they still had to depend on their former owners, now as laborers, under more or less conditions, more or less similar conditions. That is what happens. Like so you'll realize later on that they say apartheid has ended in South Africa, but they've dispossessed us of our land, of our economy, and we continue to be appendages of the white capitalist system. That is what happened when slavery was abolished in the early 1800s, in the 1834 to 1838. And as a result, because the Dutch colonial settlers were so dependent on slaves, their continuous conflicts with the British settlers, they then said, no, we need to move inland. Let us leave this area and go and establish our own area in terms of what should happen. And then they then moved inward in the so-called Great Trek, which started in 1835. So the Afrikaners, about 5,000 of them, say that let us leave and then go inland. And in all their movements, they always met with indigenous black Africans and conquered them in almost all the wars and took over their land, took over their animals, destroyed their systems of cultivation, destroyed everything because they had military superiority. And then the British, who were dominant in the Cape, in 1843, they went to take over a territory that they called Natal. So Natal then became a British colony. So in their voyages inland, the Afrikaners then established the Orange River Colony, which is currently the Free State Province. And then later on established something called the South African Republic, the Transvaal, which then established what earlier became early forms of state formation. All of those excluded black people, treated black people as subhumans or as not human beings. They were counted as part of the animals, that they cannot have any right over these territories that they have now institutionalized and turned into political territories with governments and laws that guided them. That is what got to happen in that particular period. So the Orange River Colony was established in 1854, and the Transvaal was established in 1856. And a significant thing then happened economically in South Africa. In 1862, there was a discovery of diamonds in Kimberley. Now, the discovery of diamonds then attracted a lot of colonial settlers. The number of people, white settlers, that descended to this part we call South Africa, to Kimberley, to the Cape, increased dramatically. And the racist laws began to be much more aggressive. They began to be much more brutal because now diamonds had been discovered in Kimberley. And then they formed the Chamber of Mines. The Chamber of Mines was an organization which says that all these people who are mining diamonds here, we must organize ourselves into a chamber that must negotiate the conditions through which we look for diamonds. And in the beginning, when diamonds were discovered, black people used to mine diamonds as well because they got to appreciate that this is a precious stone. It has got economic value. But the Chamber of Mines utilized the Cape colony to pass laws that said that it is now illegal for black people to be involved in mining. They must not be those artisanal miners. They must not be involved. They then cut off the participation of black people in the extraction of those diamonds, because a lot of them were at surface level. Like, there were so many diamonds that were easily accessible. That is why we have got later on a very huge hole in Kimberley, which was created by that diamond mining process, which was anchored by the likes of Cecil John Rose, a colonial murderer who was a governor of the Cape Colony. But then with the intensification of mining, they then realized, just before we get that, I want to start with something else. And then later on, in 1886, there was then discovery of gold in the area called Witwatersrand, Johannesburg currently. So with the discovery of gold, they then realized that there is a problem with sourcing a lot of black workers who must come and work in the mines, because these mines were labor absorptive, meaning that we needed a lot of people to go and dig the diamonds, to dig the gold, because now they were beginning to institutionalize all these extraction activities. To come back to the point which I wanted to raise now is that then when they realized that there is a crisis of shortage of labor, they then passed an act called the Glen Grey Act, which now forced all Africans to pay taxes, to say that for you to exist in the Cape, you must pay tax. You must pay tax, and the tax must be paid through money. So you must be engaged in waged labor. So the Glen Grey Act was passed with the support of Jan van Riebeeck, not Jan van Riebeeck, of Cecil John Rose, who said that let us pass this law in order to remove these black people from the life of sloth and laziness. Let us teach them the dignity of labor and make them give some return for our wise and good government. That is what Cecil John Rhodes said. And you will know that during that period, Cecil John Rhodes who was a student of colonialism in Oxford University. He was then engaged in colonial voyages, which established territories he named after himself, Rhodesia, which is currently Zambia and Zimbabwe, one being southern, the other one being northern Rhodesia, as a result of what got to happen. So, comrades, this is this is the context of a situation that discovery of gold, discovery of diamonds, Africans who were surviving without engaging in waged labor are now forced through laws to engage in waged labor, because they must now pay taxes. If you don't pay taxes, they come and burn down your houses. They come and burn down, they come and dispossess you of the animals that you needed for your own subsistence and survival as a people. Then the laws, the repressive laws, began to be much more brutal, because there is now discovery of precious minerals here in the part we call South Africa today. And for that period, although you had the dominions that were controlled by the Boers, the Afrikaners, which is Transvaal and Orange River Colony, and then the British controlling the Cape and Natal. Let's call them 4 provinces. The major players in mining, in the mining of diamonds and in the mining of gold, were people and companies that were associated or had the approval of the British Empire. So you had some degree of ethno-racial capitalism, which said that only the descendants of British or those who respected the British Empire must be involved in the productive sectors of the economy. And the Boers were then engaged in agriculture in a larger scale than they were involved in the mining activities. That is why there was no major mining company that was owned or associated with the Afrikaners during that particular period. It was mostly companies that were associated with the British Empire. At the forefront of that was Cecil John Rhodes, who founded De Beers. De Beers later on was reconstituted into Anglo-American. Anglo-American literally got to own almost the whole of South Africa, of the whole of Southern Africa, in terms of the control of all the mining activities that were happening at that particular period. I want to highlight something that is very important within that context. That so 1886 is discovery of gold, and then in 1870 you then had the nascent development of African political consciousness, because before that Africans used to fight against colonial settlers as clans, as tribal groups. Our resistance to colonialism, it was as clans and as tribal groups. We never had a consolidated African conscious resistance to colonialism. We always fought against them as and when they came into contact with us. We always fought for our own immediate interests. But then what later on became to be clearer, nascent emergence of political consciousness amongst Africans started with a publication called Isigidi Misamaxhosa, which was started in 1870, which was a publication that began to voice political opposition to colonial settlement and settlers that were beginning to, who for many years had terrorized and taken the land of the African majority. But then in September 1882, the first political organization of Africans called Imbumba Yamanyama was started, which was mostly founded by the contributors to Isigidi, which we spoke about now. So the first political organization of black people in South Africa, which was started in the area we called Port Elizabeth today, or Nelson Mandela Bay, was called Imbumba Yamanyama, which started in 1882. But because missionaries, mostly British missionaries, had arrived in the early 1800s, in 1882 in particular, and had different church denominations, Imbumba Yamanyama had divisions that were according to church denominations, meaning that those who identified themselves as Anglican or Presbyterian or Wesleyan, they always had differences even within Imbumba Yamanyama. That is why the secretary of Imbumba Yamanyama in 1882 said that we are making a fatal mistake to be divided as Africans. He said that for a black man, is making a fatal mistake of thinking that he is Anglican, that he has nothing to do with the Presbyterians, and that for a Presbyterian to think that has got nothing to do with the Wesleyan is also a big problem. And then he says that although they look as if they belong to various churches, the white people are solidly united when it comes to matters of politics and suppression of the black people. That is what Samuel Mvambo, the secretary of Imbumba Yamanyama, said in 1882 that it is very easy to stratify Africans even alongside religious lines. And he says that these people who are oppressing us are united when it comes to political oppression and the economic conquest of what they've taken from all of us. And another platform for Africans to express their political perspectives later on came from a publication which was founded by John Tengo Jabavu, who used to be a contributor as well in Isigidim. And then he started a publication in 1884 called Imvo Zabatundu. Imvo Zabatundu, that the opinions of black people. And then he used to then get the then emerging black intelligentsia to speak about issues that had an impact on the lives of black people. But a worrying issue about Imvo Zabatundu is that it had some funding and some degree of political control from people who belonged to the cabinet of Cecil John Rhodes in the Cape Colony. And those were James Rose Innes and Jacobus Sauer. And a person called John X. Merriman. So those ones, they had some proximity to John Tengo Jabavu because although he was not allowed to stand for elections, he used to campaign for them to be elected into the government of the Cape Colony. And then they had some degree of control over the Imvo Zabatundu, which was a platform to articulate African perspectives. And of course, we cannot underestimate the massive contributions that John Tengo Jabavu made in literature and in conscientization of the African people here in South Africa. He played a very important role. That is important to highlight, comrades, and we must always go and read further in that regard. Now, we have got these four colonies: Transvaal, Orange River Colony, Natal, and the Cape. And then in the period 1899 to 1902, there was the South African War, which in the master colonial narrative is called the Anglo-Boer War. Why do we call it South African War? Is because all people who were staying in the part we call South Africa now were involved. A lot of black people were involved, and majority of them on the side of the British colony, on the side of the British Empire, because they resisted the Afrikaner descendants, the Afrikaner Dutch descendants. Those settlers, they did not want to abolish slavery. They were the most racist. They were the most intolerant to black people. So when that war, the so-called Anglo-Boer War happened, black people fought on the side of the Anglo. That is why it is a South African war, which in history it is distorted as just a war of white people. Of course, it was a war to protect white interests. And that war was not insignificant. The British Empire, because now they know that the territory where the war is happening is a war for control. And in that territory, there is gold, there is diamonds. There's potentially other minerals that can be discovered. They sent not less than 400,000 soldiers to come and fight in the South African War. And they emerged victorious. The Afrikaners were defeated in that war. And they surrendered in what later on became the Treaty of Vereeniging, signed in 1902 to end the war. And then the four colonies then became British dominions, meaning that they were under the control of the British Empire, which was dominating many parts of the world in that particular period. And later on, when the British Empire realized that these areas are next to each other, and they are almost having some common history, They actually agitated for the unification of these four territories: Transvaal, Orange River, Natal, and the Cape. They then said that let us allow these people to negotiate. Let them talk amongst themselves. But the ultimate solution must be a formation of a union of South Africa. And then they started in 1908. And they started a conference in 1908 and deliberations, the Convention for South Africa, which started in 1908 and finished in 1909. That convention was attended by 33 white men who were discussing the future of South Africa. They were basically discussing what do they make of these four colonies, because the empire is now saying that we must unite. It looks like we've got no choice. How do we realize that unity? And then in 1909, they reached a conclusion that they must found the Union of South Africa to combine the four territories to form the Union of South Africa. And because they could not agree on where the capital city of this new unitary state must be, they then said that let us split the capitals. They then say that the Orange River colony is going to have the judicial capital. So the Supreme Court must be located in the Orange River colony, which is in Bloemfontein. The Supreme Court of Appeal is still there today. And then they say that the administrative capital must be Pretoria, representing the Transvaal. That is where the administrative capital of South Africa is still today. And then they said the legislative capital must be in Cape Town to represent the Cape Province. That is where the legislative capital, Parliament, is still in Cape Town. Although it is irrational to have a Parliament in Cape Town, it is still there. An agreement reached amongst 33 white men in 1909 to form a unitary state with split capitals. And then Natal did not get a capital, but they agreed in those negotiations that this unitary state must complete a railway project which the governors of Natal were engaged in that particular period. But before that, let us highlight something very important, that when consciousness, African political consciousness, was rising through publications and formation of congresses in different parts of these four colonies, like there was a Cape Congress, Natal Congress, Transvaal Congress. When political consciousness was emerging, when black leaders were beginning to say that don't exclude us in this convention of South Africa, we want to participate as well, then there was still resistance, because in Natal, when the farmers realized that a lot of black people are now forced to go to work in the mines in order to pay their taxes and to now integrate into the emerging capitalist system, the nonsense capitalist system, they then did their own form of Glen Grey Act to say that all indigenous people in Natal, in KwaZulu, must pay taxes, must pay poll taxes. And then one leader who resisted that was Bambata. He said that will never happen. It will never accept that. You cannot impose that. And then in one of the incidents, when those colonial administrators were going to collect taxes by force from where Bambata was a chief at, those two colonial administrators were killed. And then the colonial administration of Natal hunted Bambata. He went to organize and engage in guerrilla warfare to resist the taxes that were being imposed by the Natal administration. But they later on caught up with him, killed him, and beheaded him in 1906. And then they went to display his head that we have killed the leader, your leader who was resisting our rule over all of you. That is what got to happen. And that is the last battle, physical resistance, which our people, which we fought against the colonial system. And that signaled the end of our resistance in a physical form, in the manner in which all the wars of resistance had taken place. So now, after the unity and agreement of those 33 men to form the Union of South Africa, they had to go to the British Parliament, the Imperial Parliament, to pass an act called the Act of the Union of South Africa, Union of South Africa Act, which said, let us unite and form one country in these 4 provinces, and then we must exclude the black majority. It must be a white-only British dominion, where the British will be having the ultimate say of what happens in that part, the geopolitical part, which then later on became South Africa. And immediately after that, they started to then pass legislations that institutionalized and legislated the exclusion of the black majority, of black people in this part we call South Africa today. The 1913 Land Act only gave 7% of the land to indigenous Africans. We were more than 5 million of the population, whilst the white population was just above 300,000. They then began to institutionalize with colonial British protection. They began to institutionalize the exclusion of black people from the control of their own land. And you will know later on they changed to 13% of the land in 1936. They then passed a lot of legislation, so many laws that were passed to exclude systematically and systemically black people from control of their own land. But one other thing that we must highlight, comrades, is that throughout, and that is the history of the African continent, the colonial settlers always used tribalism to divide the African people. So ethnic groups and tribes exist, but tribalism, they always tried to sow divisions amongst the indigenous people. They did not want Africans to unite in terms of what happens. So this Union of South Africa was officially launched on the 31st of May, 1910, to then say that we have got our own whites-only government in terms of what happens. I'm going to come back to the issue of tribal divisions and the tribalism. Why did they do that? And systematically ingrained it amongst Africans, because they did not want working class consciousness and African consciousness to develop amongst all of us. They wanted us to identify ourselves as Xhosa, as Zulu, as Venda, as Tswana, as Sotho. They always tried to stratify all of us in terms of what happens. So in most African countries, what they would do when colonial settlers would arrive, they will in some instances co-opt a certain tribal group and govern society with that tribal group, with the aim of creating the hatred amongst the people, that no, you are collaborating with the system. But in South Africa, because there were many, they just stratified us, even designed literally everything, including spatial patterns in townships that were defined along tribal lines, even hostel dwellings. In hostels, they will say that those who speak Tsonga must say this side, Zulu this side, Xhosa this side, because they always wanted us to have loyalty to our tribes, not to ourselves as Africans. That is how they got to then deal with all of us in terms of what happens. And you will know that as a reaction to the Union of South Africa, which was launched on the 31st of May 1910, then the different conscious African political leaders began to say that we need to unite to form one national organization that must beg or demand participation in this new Union of South Africa. And that is how the South African Natives National Congress came about, which is called the ANC now. So it was called the South African Natives National Congress. It brought chiefs from different areas, religious leaders, and the emerging black intelligentsia to say, let us form one organization, not to overthrow the colonial government, but to beg for participation within the colonial table. That is why the form and content and pace of struggle of the South African Natives National Congress was to beg for inclusion into the colonial government. The SANNC, we have said this before, was not a revolutionary movement, was not an anti-colonial movement. It was not an anti-racist movement. It was a movement that said, we acknowledge and honor your government, just allow us to participate, and not all of us allow the civilized black men to participate in the colonial table. We are not like these other ones who do not know how to read, who do not know how to write, who do not understand civilization. We are actually better off. So include us in that platform. That is what the SANNC was fighting for. That is why the SANNC always respected and honored the British Empire. So every time they used to send petitions to King George V, they would always say, we honor you, our king, we respect you, we honor your dominion over us. We will always respect your throne. They were always saluting a white king. So you had this organization that claims to be revolutionary throughout its history, honoring colonial conquerors. People who have defeated us, they knew throughout that our people were defeated by colonialism, but they continued to honor and respect the colonial edifice. That is where we come from in terms of what happened. And of course, that did not come without resistance internally. And maybe one of the internal resistance in the SANNC that came was with the class concertization of its fourth president, J.T. Gumede, who went to attend the 10th anniversary of the Great Socialist October Revolution celebrations in Russia in 1927. And J.T. Gumede, when he came back, he says that I've seen a new Jerusalem and I've brought back the keys that are going to unlock our door to freedom. And when J.T. Gumede said that, those middle-class, conservative black leaders in the SNNC organized a quick conference and said, you cannot call for this socialist system. You cannot praise the Soviet Union. We, as black leaders, we do not want to be at the same level as the people who milk our cattle. Don't equate us. We do not want this system of equality. We are fighting for ourselves, not for everyone. And you are now saying we must fight for everyone. That is problematic. That is why he was immediately replaced, and then the SANNC began to degenerate in a manner that was not sustainable. And of course, then it continued, sometimes with some degree of pushing a bit harder, but their method of struggle was petitions to the Parliament of South Africa, whites-only parliament, and petitions to the British Empire. That is why they supported the participation of black people in the First World War. They even went to tell the king in England that we have actually given 17,000 men to fight on your side in the First World War, because they honored the British Empire. That is what got to define the SANNC. And how did that change? We must have to fast track these, comrades. I'm sure we'll be able to read. We cannot exhaust these things. It got to change in the early 1940s when the young are much more militant and radical, clear leadership, the youth in the Congress movement, which was now called in the ANC, said we need to form a youth league which must radicalize this Congress movement, which must begin to demand for one person, one vote, which must fight for true freedom, which must stop respecting the colonial administration. That is what got to radicalize later on the liberation movement, which was that time led by the ANC. And who were those people? It was Anton Lembede, it was Mxolisi Majombozi, it was William Nkomo, it was Robert Sobukwe, Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu. Those are the people who said that we need to now fight differently, because these things of peaceful negotiations and petitions do not assist in any way in terms of what got to happen. And then as part of that radicalization, the Congress Youth League was launched in 1944, and the clarion call was freedom in our lifetime. And they meant that when they said freedom in our lifetime, they were not just theorizing. They said we're going to fight with everything in our power to realize freedom in our lifetime. Generation after generation, our people have been defeated, have been subjected to white minority racist nonsensical rule. Now we want to take this struggle and we must realize this freedom from oppression, from exploitation, when we are still alive. So when you say freedom in our lifetime, you say we're going to realize freedom when we are still alive. So that is a generation that got to radicalize the Congress movement, the ANC, and that they got to even change the leadership of the ANC in the 1949 conference, when they got to elect Dr. J.S. Moroka as a president, who was not necessarily associated with the Congress movement before that. And then you would know then there was the Defiance Campaign. When the Defiance Campaign led by Nelson Mandela happened, the Congress movement, the ANC, had less than 4,000 members. But after the Defiance Campaign, which was now a practical resistance against apartheid or against colonial laws, the membership grew to more than 100,000 within that period of the Defiance Campaign, because people appreciate, they see when we are involved in real struggles, they then began to appreciate that, yeah, these ones at least now they're taking up our issues. They are not doing those peaceful things of sending petitions of middle-class people to Cape Town and to Britain, wearing three-piece suits every time. That is when they then began to be a relevant organization. And you would know that in 1955, exactly 65 years ago, then the Freedom Charter was adopted on the 26th of June. The Freedom Charter was now the clearest expression of what are the intentions of the liberation movement, that time under the leadership of the ANC, by saying that, well, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, which the Africanist faction saw as a sellout position. We'll explain that now. And then said that no government can claim authority over the people unless it is elected by all the people. That is why then the colonial apartheid government began to say, this is a problem. And you will know that, so it's 1944, formation of the Congress Youth League. 1948, The National Party wins elections. The Afrikaner Nationalist Party wins elections and runs South Africa white-only elections. And they don't change the laws of the British dominion and colonialism which they got from the beginning of the Union of South Africa and from the beginning of colonialism. They just make them much more brutal. They just make them much more fierce. They just become much more violent against black people, against any forms of resistance. They just perfect what they'd inherited from Cecil John Rhodes. That is what got to happen during that particular period in terms of the developments of South Africa. And of course, the more brutal they became, the more they got to radicalize the youth that said that we must fight back, we must do everything in our power. Freedom Charter is adopted in 1955 by the Congress of the People, which was meant to be a platform of all people who were now interested in the freedom project in South Africa. Then the ANC discussed the Freedom Charter separately, only adopted it in 1956. That is when the Africanist faction said that, but there's a program which we adopted in 1949. 1944 we had a program of action. 1948 we developed something as the Congress Youth League. 1949 the conference of the ANC in Bloemfontein adopted a much more radical program. Now you are saying we must adopt a freedom charter that says that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. This is our nation. It belongs to us as African people. That is why the likes of William Nkomo and Robert Sobukwe said, this thing of the ANC is now beginning to collaborate with the white establishment. Let us go and form our own organization. And then they existed first as an Africanist faction within the Congress movement. And in 1959 formed the Pan-Africanist Congress. And then when they formed the Pan-Africanist Congress, they then got to lead the 21st of March 1960 anti-pulse campaign, which led to the massacre in Sharpeville, the massacre of people who were protesting peacefully. The apartheid police massacred defenseless Africans in Sharpeville in 1960, 21st March, which is called Human Rights Day today. But the existence of the Pan-Africanist Congress then began to even radicalize more that generation which said freedom in our lifetime in 1944. That component which remained in the Congress Youth League then said that it looks like we must stop this thing of non-violent resistance to apartheid. We must no longer take this approach of tiptoeing around the apartheid government. Let us take up arms, let us fight to overthrow this regime. And without the approval, without a formal resolution of the ANC, Umkhonto weSizwe was formed in 1960. It was formed as now the beginning of the armed struggle. And one thing which comrades were saying so many things, there are so many things to say, I want to highlight is that after the adoption of the Freedom Charter, the apartheid regime arrested 156 leaders of the Congress movement who had adopted the Freedom Charter to say that, what do you mean that South Africa belongs to all who live in it and you want all of you to participate in elections? Because this Freedom Charter that you have adopted also says that the mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks and monopoly industries must be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole. So in the treason trial, Exhibit 1 on the state side was the Freedom Charter, that this is the document through which we're charging you through, that this is crime in terms of what happened. That is why they also passed an act of parliament. The whites-only government passed an act of parliament called the Rio Test Assemblies Act to now strengthen a mechanism to stop the resistance that was now beginning to intensify against apartheid. The Rio Test Assemblies Act, which was passed during that period in 1956, is the same Rio Test Assemblies Act which the current Commander-in-Chief of the EFF, Commander-in-Chief Julius Malema, is being trialed with or trialed through by the ANC post-1994 government. It was an instrument, an act of parliament used to suppress the Freedom Charter, used to suppress the now rising militancy of the struggles against apartheid and colonialism. That is what got to happen. Then I spoke about now the radicalization, 1960 massacre, then the apartheid government banned the SACP, well, the SACP was banned earlier. They banned the PAC and the ANC and all black political formations to say that they are no longer existing in terms of law. Then the people who were playing a central role in the formation of Umkhonto weSizwe as a fighting arm of the liberation struggle were then arrested in a house in Rivonia, Johannesburg. And then they were trial. That is why that trial was called the Rivonia trial. And what compromised the Rivonia trialists was evidenced by a person from KwaZulu-Natal called Bruno Mtolo. Bruno Mtolo was part of that command which was now emerging to say, let us take up the arms against apartheid. So he knew inside information about what the liberation forces, Nelson Mandela, and all, Walter Sisulu, all of them, what they were planning. And then he went to testify against them in the Rivonia trial and gave out everything. And there was a clear intention, by the way, by the state that these leaders must be executed, must be killed for trying to overthrow the apartheid government. But Bruno Mutolo did not say anything wrong with selling out his own comrades. And the reason why he did so, he was saying in one of the notes that these people are living better than us. You know, like this intra-black jealousies. To say, actually, he was saying that if you go to the house of Walter Sisulu, the floor is shining. You can even see yourself. It's like a mirror. These people of Walter Sisulu and Nelson Mandela, they even dress better. And that became the reason why Bruno Mtolo went to sell out those Rivonia trialists who almost got killed, executed because of the Rivonia trial. And then they were later on sentenced to life imprisonment, taken to Robben Island for a very long time. Nelson Mandela spent 18 years in Robben Island, and then the remaining period, which later on added to 27 years, in other areas, in Paulsmoor, in a house, in terms of what got to happen. And it is important, comrades, that after the banning of the liberation movements, the PAC and the ANC, they were exiled. A lot of them went into exile to different parts of the African continent. They were accommodated by African governments, poor African governments that did not have money to even meet their own demands. They took care of the liberation forces, trained them militarily in Algeria and Tanzania, all of them in Zambia, in Tanzania, like all of those. They then said in Uganda, in Nigeria, they said, let's accommodate you. Let's prepare you to go and fight back for your own freedom. They did not engage in xenophobic attacks to say, no, go back. You're going to finish our little resources here. They accommodated a lot of exiles that went to go and be based in those territories, despite the difficulties that they faced themselves as mostly emerging countries that have just gained their own independence. They said, let us fight together with the people of South Africa to realize their own independence, their own freedom. And you will know that in that period, then there was mostly a political lull. So the politics were now suppressed significantly in South Africa. The political voice that got to fill that vacuum came in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, with the formation of the South African Students' Organization under the capable leadership of Steve Bantu Biko, and the beginning of the Black Consciousness movement. It occupied the vacuum that existed, first as a student organization, but later on as an organization that mobilized all Black people. The formation of the Black Convention, the People's Convention, which was under the leadership of the Black Consciousness movement, which was not just theorizing politics. They were not theoreticians. They used to be involved in practical developmental projects, building of clinics, and running programs that got to develop communities. That is one distinct feature about the Steve Biko-led Black Consciousness movement. And you would know that the Black Consciousness movement later on inspired the June 16 uprisings in Soweto. And the June 16 uprisings in Soweto intensified the massive youth resistance against apartheid. The formation of COSAS was a Congress movement's response to the June 16 uprisings, which when it happened, the ANC condemned. But when they realized the militance of youth, they then went to form the Congress of South African Students in 1979. But then later on, the formation of youth congresses in many parts of South Africa. And you'll know that in 1975, there was formation of Inkatha Freedom Party. Well, the leader of Inkatha Freedom Party claims that he was instructed by Oliver Tambo to form Inkatha Freedom Party. But it was an organization which was, of course, buying into the colonial agenda of the apartheid system, of the colonial apartheid system, in the manner that it got to be in terms of what happens. Then the formation of Congress movements and Congress, youth congresses that were beginning to emerge, because the Congress movement, which did not have a plan on South Africa's liberation, now realized that the youth have taken up amongst themselves to fight against apartheid. And of course, there were so many opportunistic elements. We spoke about this in the other presentation, that the white capitalist establishment started to co-opt Black leaders through the Urban Foundation, and those included Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president of South Africa. He's a product of the Urban Foundation. He was molded by them. He is their entry to the ANC. Nelson Mandela later on got to be integrated into the Menel, the Oppenheimer's control and guidance because of Cyril Ramaphosa. So that 1976 could have given an intensification of the struggle, but it also gave opportunistic elements, access to the liberation movement in terms of what happened. That is why the first offices of the National Union of Mine Workers, which Cyril Ramaphosa led, were bought by Harry Oppenheimer. It's in the history of the NUM. It's an Oppenheimer product that got to define the politics of that time, but also due to the pressure that was exerting on the system that time. Then in 1983, there was formation of the United Democratic Front. In the beginning, it was not associated, but the youth component of the militant forces were the biggest affiliates of the UDF. So UDF was an organization of so many organizations that were existing in resistance to apartheid in many parts of South Africa. So a lot of people who said they were involved in struggle in South Africa internally, they got to be organized later on by the UDF, which was an umbrella body of organizations that were existing in many parts of South Africa. But the youth constituted the majority of the affiliates of the UDF. Now, in 1984, the apartheid regime said they are trying to reform apartheid by now saying, let us allow Indians and coloreds into parliament. And then they passed something called the Tricameral Parliament Act, where Indians and coloreds will be allowed into parliament with whites. And even the manner in which the parliamentary villages are designed in Cape Town, they say Acacia Park is for white people, Laboria Park for colored, and Pelican Park for Indian members of parliament. It is still like that today, but the racial composition, I don't know how it is being handled, but it was a design of the tricameral parliament, which was now beginning to concede to the pressures that were coming first because of the militancy of the June 16, 1976 uprising. And then when capital was beginning to co-opt the leaders who were here in South Africa, it then sent a delegation in 1985 to start negotiations with the ANC in exile. In Livingstone in 1985, they began to discuss with the ANC for a transition to say, we will give you political power, but we want to retain economic power. All the observations, comrades, there are so many books, like Alex Borain has written a book. He was one of the people who were negotiating there. He illustrates that those people of the ANC, they actually they were not opposed to capitalism continuing almost in the same form as it is. They are not a threat to us. Almost all observations, these observations which we showed earlier in this book of the Shadow of Liberation, it shows the same collaborationist approach of the liberation movement. This observation by Sam Bitele Branch, the reality is, let us say it clearly, that South Africa's transition, although it was driven by the mass mobilization, by the Battle of Quito Carnival, which Komisafana has spoken about excellently in his other presentation, the reality is that the liberation project was hijacked by a class agenda of the white capitalist establishment in South Africa. That is why we are where we are now. So with the collapse of the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1991, mostly from 1989, Nelson Mandela was released from prison and all political parties were unbanned in 1990. And when he announced that release, de Klerk said that we are releasing him because there is no longer a threat for socialism in South Africa. We're going to have a system that is going to be governed by capitalists forever. And when Mandela came out of prison, initially he was radical in terms of economic policy, but it was highly contested by global and domestic capitalists. Harry Oppenheimer prides himself in his own biography, the biography which they have approved as the Brandes Group, that one of the achievements that he has made is to teach the ANC how to be capitalists, how to be economic stewardship. Whichever way you see it, the liberation project in South Africa was a class project which got to benefit the white capitalist class. And you will know that later on, 1996 or 1994, constitutional first democratic elections, and the elections happened because they had now consolidated a perspective. They had signed a lot of transitional agreements. The IMF had given loan to South Africa in 1992. They killed Chris Hani in 1993. Then they said, no, now because we have cleared the ground, we can give you political power. We are going to take economic power, will continue to do business as usual. I think we have canvassed that point sufficiently in the other presentation. That is where we got to be, that South Africa was given political power. Black people were given political power without economic power. It is similar to the abolition of slavery, where they take your land, make you slaves, take everything that you own, and then later on that you are a free slave, now you can go. Where are you going to go because you are landless? You do not have control of anything. That is what got to happen in South Africa. They even conceptualized black economic empowerment, Anglo-American, conceptualized black economic empowerment and co-opted the black emerging middle class into a system where they're going to dominate themselves with appendages of black people as faces of black success, whilst majority of our people still remain in abject and absolute poverty. The history of South Africa is the history of white people who have come to take over our land, our economy, and they are still in control of that economy today. And of course, then there are so many things that happen, which, by the way, they have not had a meaningful impact on the lives of our people. GIA adoption 1996, Thabo Mbeki 1999, re-elected in 2004, removed correctly from office in 2008. Kgalema Motlanthe, caretaker for a few months. Jacob Zuma elected as a disaster president from 2009. And then he is removed by Ramaphosa in 2008. And then we've got Ramaphosa now, who had killed workers, who agitated for the killing of workers in Marikana in 2012. I'm deliberately concluding now with this important part of history, that when in the Congress movement, there was beginning to be realization that this freedom project, this liberation project, is a class project which is fake, which is not focusing on the land question, which is not focusing on the mineral resources. Then a younger generation in the Congress Youth League, in the African National Congress Youth League from 2008, under the capable leadership of Julius Malema, started to say that things cannot continue to be like they've been throughout. We've had so many years of freedom from 1994 until now, but our people are still suffering. And that is why there was a call for expropriation of land without compensation. That is why there was a call for nationalization of mines and banks and other strategic sectors of the economy. And in the Congress movement, because the Youth League, the economic freedom fighters generation in the ANC Youth League was very cogent and very persuasive. It was able to persuade the National General Council of the ANC to adopt greater consensus on nationalization of mines. You must go and check their resolutions during that period, that they adopted greater consensus on nationalization of mines and began to say that the willing buyer, willing seller principle must change. And that is why at the leadership of the Congress Youth League that time was taken out of the Congress Youth League, expelled by a project which wanted to continue protecting the white capitalist interests. And out of that, but also combined with radical forces outside of the Congress movement, the Economic Freedom Fighters was launched on the 26th and 27th of July 2013. The Economic Freedom Fighters is a Marxist-Leninist Fanonian economic emancipation movement, which is going to make sure that there is historical justice in South Africa, which is going to make sure that there is return of the land. There's going to be the repossession of all the land that was taken through colonial barbarism. We're going to reclaim our economy. That is what the Economic Freedom Fighters stands for. Comrades, let us write the history of South Africa by fighting and taking the baton from those that fought before us. They tried all forms of mechanisms to fight. They were defeated. Bambata was killed and his head was displayed for all to see that he cannot do anything. We cannot allow that with our leadership now. Robert Sobukwe was isolated. Steve Biko was killed because he represented the true agenda of black people. We must never allow that the current system must assassinate our leaders. We must never agree that the current capitalist agenda, its media representatives, and those who are in charge of the state must character assassinate our leadership. We must not be naive every time people raise petty issues. We join into the band of wanting to say that there is everything wrong with our leaders. Let us not be the Bruno Mtolos of our generation. Let us be the fearless fighters. Let us take the spirit from Solomon Mahlangu, who even when they said we're going to kill you, he said that I am not afraid. My blood is going to nourish the tree that will bear the fruits of freedom. That is the spirit that must guide all of us. But comrades, what we need to do in conclusion is that let us pay detailed attention of where we come from and where we are going, so that we can intensify the struggle for economic freedom in our lifetime. We will never win this battle if we do not have a thorough comprehension of what happened with our forefathers. We will never win this battle if we do not provide proper and honest critique of the current nonsensical neo-colonial capitalist system. We have to expose colonialism everywhere it manifests itself, and here in South Africa, we are still living under a neo-colonial capitalist system. That is why majority of black people are still living in poverty. They've got nothing. They've got no shelter. They've got no jobs. We have to beg white minorities for our own survival. That must come to an end. And comrades, let us continue to engage and make sure that we fight on for economic freedom in our lifetime. It's no surrender, no retreat. Amandla!